The morning of August 15, 1943, brought suffocating humidity to the dense jungles of New Georgia in the Solomon Islands. Staff Sergeant James "Jimmy" Carter of the 93rd Infantry Division crouched behind a moss-covered log, his uniform soaked through with sweat and rainwater, watching the morning mist rise from the jungle floor like ghosts of soldiers past. The 28-year-old soldier from Birmingham, Alabama, had spent the last 6 hours leading a 12-man reconnaissance patrol through terrain so thick that visibility barely extended beyond 10 feet in any direction. He believed this would be another routine patrol, perhaps spotting enemy supply routes, maybe calling in coordinates for artillery support. He had absolutely no idea that within the next hour a simple object in his breast pocket, a gift from his wife that he had carried since leaving home, would transform him from an overlooked soldier in a segregated unit into a tactical genius whose actions would be studied in military academies for generations to come. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Staff Sergeant Carter was about to demonstrate would challenge every assumption about improvisation, quick thinking, and the power of resourcefulness when conventional weapons and tactics fail completely. His story would prove that sometimes the most effective tool in combat is not the one issued by the quartermaster, but the one born from desperate necessity and brilliant improvisation combined with knowledge gained far from any battlefield. The 93rd Infantry Division held a unique and often deliberately overlooked place in the American military structure of World War II. Reactivated in May of 1942, this division was composed entirely of African-American enlisted men, led primarily by white officers assigned from other units, though some black officers served in junior positions when the military's rigid racial policies permitted. The division's lineage traced back to the Buffalo Soldiers of the post-Civil War era, those legendary cavalry regiments that had fought Native American tribes in the Western Territories and Mexican revolutionaries along the border. The nickname Buffalo Soldiers carried forward through generations, passed down like a sacred trust, a badge of honor representing resilience, courage, and the ongoing fight for recognition in a nation that simultaneously needed their service, desperately yet questioned their capabilities at every turn. By the summer of 1943, elements of the 93rd had been deployed to the Solomon Islands, that strategic chain of volcanic islands stretching southeast from Papua New Guinea toward Australia. The strategic importance of these islands cannot be overstated in any meaningful analysis of the Pacific theater. Control of the Solomons meant control of critical supply routes to Australia and New Zealand, meant establishing air bases within striking distance of Japanese positions throughout the South Pacific, meant the difference between mounting an offensive campaign that could roll back Japanese territorial gains systematically, or accepting a defensive stalemate that could prolong the conflict for years with mounting casualties. Staff Sergeant Carter had joined the Army in March of 1941, 6 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor that would transform America from a reluctant observer to an active participant in global conflict. In civilian life, he had worked as a high school mathematics teacher in Birmingham's segregated school system, a profession that had sharpened his analytical mind and his ability to solve complex problems with limited resources and inadequate materials. Those skills, combined with natural leadership abilities that had made him a respected figure in Birmingham's black community, had earned him rapid promotion through the enlisted ranks, despite the systemic barriers that prevented most African-American soldiers from advancing beyond private or corporal. But Carter, like thousands of other African-American servicemen deployed across theaters from Europe to the Pacific, found himself fighting two distinct but interconnected conflicts simultaneously: the shooting conflict against imperial forces in the Jungle Islands, and the quieter but no less real conflict against prejudice and segregation within his own military establishment. The patrol that morning consisted of 12 men, all handpicked by Carter personally for their reliability, technical competence, and ability to maintain cool heads under pressure when circumstances deteriorated rapidly. There was Corporal Robert "Bobby" Washington from Detroit, a former automotive factory worker whose mechanical aptitude had proven invaluable, for keeping their equipment functional in the corrosive humidity that destroyed metal and degraded rubber. Private First Class Ernest Thompson from rural Georgia brought hunting skills learned tracking deer and wild boar through southern forests that translated perfectly to jungle tracking and silent movement. Private Leon Davis from Philadelphia possessed hearing so extraordinarily acute he could distinguish between the sound of a Japanese Type 99 rifle and an American M1 Garand from hundreds of yards away, based solely on the subtle differences in their firing signatures. Private Marcus Johnson from Chicago had served as an amateur radio operator before the conflict and possessed an intuitive understanding of communications that made him invaluable for maintaining contact with battalion headquarters. These men, and the 8 others in the patrol including Private James Mitchell, Private Samuel Brooks, Private Andrew Williams, Private David Turner, Private Charles Anderson, Private Thomas Jackson, Private William Harris, and Private Joseph Martinez represented the absolute best of what the 93rd had to offer in terms of training, dedication, and combat effectiveness. Their mission parameters seemed straightforward enough when briefed the previous evening. Intelligence reports from local coast watchers, those brave souls who remained behind enemy lines to observe and report enemy movements, suggested Japanese forces were using a particular valley system as a supply route, connecting their coastal defensive positions with inland strongpoints. The patrol's job was to confirm the route's existence through direct observation, estimate the volume of traffic based on visible evidence, and, if possible, identify suitable locations for future ambush or interdiction operations by larger forces. Standard reconnaissance work, the kind that required patience, stealth, and careful observation rather than direct engagement with enemy forces. What intelligence had not reported, what no aerial reconnaissance photographs had detected despite multiple flights over the area, was that the Japanese had established a platoon-sized outpost at the valley's narrowest point, a natural choke point where steep ridges on either side created a passage barely 50 yards wide at its base. 37 soldiers from the Imperial Army's 38th Division, veterans of campaigns in China and experienced in jungle warfare, occupied this position with considerable expertise. They were equipped with 3 Type 92 heavy machine guns, 2 Type 89 grenade discharger launchers, and more than adequate small arms including rifles, submachine guns, and hand grenades for the terrain they defended so effectively. Carter first sensed something wrong when the jungle sounds changed in a way that triggered his survival instincts. Anyone who has spent significant time in tropical forests understands they possess their own distinct rhythm, their own audio signature that varies by time of day and weather conditions. Birds call in predictable patterns throughout daylight hours. Insects maintain a constant drone that rises and falls but never truly ceases. Small animals rustle through undergrowth following routes they have traveled countless times. When those patterns break abruptly, when silence falls where constant sound should be, when birds stop calling and insects cease their droning, experienced soldiers know to freeze instantly and listen with every sense heightened. Carter raised his fist, the universal military signal to halt, and his patrol melted into the undergrowth with the practiced ease of men who understood that visibility meant vulnerability and survival often depended on becoming invisible. The sound that had triggered Carter's combat instinct came from ahead and slightly to the right. The distinctly metallic click of a weapon bolt being pulled back and released, barely audible through the ambient jungle noise, but unmistakable to ears trained to recognize such sounds. Then came voices speaking Japanese in conversational tones that suggested men at ease, men who believed themselves secure in their position and unthreatened by any immediate danger. Carter hand-signaled Washington to move up beside him, and the 2 men low-crawled forward with painstaking slowness until they could see through a narrow gap in the thick foliage. What they observed made Carter's stomach tighten with the professional concern of a soldier recognizing a truly dangerous tactical situation. The Japanese position was expertly constructed, taking full advantage of every natural feature the terrain offered. 3 heavy machine gun positions had been established on elevated ground covering the valley floor, creating interlocking fields of fire that would transform the narrow passage into an absolute killing zone for any force attempting to move through. Infantry fighting positions lined both ridges, camouflaged with such extraordinary skill using local vegetation that even from 50 yards away, Carter could only identify them by occasional slight movements when personnel shifted positions or adjusted equipment. A quick mental count, constantly revised as he observed more positions, suggested at least 30 soldiers visible, with possibly more in positions he could not observe from his current angle. The defensive setup was textbook perfect, exactly what military doctrine called for when defending a choke point with limited forces. Carter carefully withdrew by inches, never making sudden movements that might be detected by alert sentries, and gathered his patrol leadership for a whispered conference 200 yards back from the enemy position, where their voices would not carry. The tactical situation presented several distinctly unappealing options, none of which offered high probability of success without significant casualties. They could withdraw completely and report the position to higher headquarters, allowing for a planned, deliberate assault by company or battalion-sized forces with appropriate artillery support. But that would consume hours or potentially days, during which the enemy might relocate or reinforce. They could attempt to bypass the position entirely and complete their original reconnaissance mission by taking a longer route, but the terrain on either side was extremely difficult, and the probability of detection while maneuvering around such an alert force was unacceptably high. Or they could engage directly, despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1 and lacking any element of surprise, a course of action that would likely result in heavy casualties even if successful. Then Corporal Washington, studying the ridge positions through his military-issue field glasses, noticed something that would ultimately change everything about how this engagement unfolded. He was examining the left ridge systematically, trying to identify exact machine gun positions, when he observed something peculiar about how sunlight was falling across the defensive setup. Washington said quietly, "Sergeant, look carefully at that ridge on the left side. Look at how the sun's hitting those positions right now." Carter took the binoculars and studied the indicated area, and immediately understood Washington's point with the clarity of recognition. The morning sun, now climbing higher in the eastern sky as time approached mid-morning, struck the left ridge at an angle that left the machine gun positions in relative shade while bathing the valley floor below in increasingly bright direct sunlight. It was actually a defensive advantage for the Japanese gunners, allowing them to observe targets moving below while remaining partially concealed themselves in shadow, reducing the glare that might affect their aim. But as Carter studied the precise geometry of sun position, ridge orientation, and valley floor alignment, his mathematics teacher's brain automatically began calculating angles, trajectories, and optical possibilities in ways that most soldiers would never consider. In his breast pocket, Carter carried a small rectangular mirror, approximately 3 inches wide by 4 inches tall, encased in protective leather that had prevented it from breaking during the rigors of jungle operations. It had been a parting gift from his wife Sarah before deployment, pressed into his hands at the train station in Birmingham on that emotional morning when he left for basic training. She had insisted he take it, despite his protests that he had no use for such things in military service. "So you can always see yourself and remember who you are, you," she had told him at the train station, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "So you never forget that you're my husband, a teacher, a good man no matter what happens over there." For 6 months of grueling training followed by deployment and combat operations, that mirror had served no military purpose whatsoever, just a small personal item that reminded him of home and love and the life waiting for him when this was all over. Now, as Carter studied the interplay of sun and shadow with a mathematician's precision, that seemingly useless mirror suddenly represented a tactical asset of potentially decisive value in the engagement developing before him. The plan that formed in Carter's mind over the next several minutes was audacious, risky, and depended on precise timing and coordination that would push his patrol to its absolute operational limits. He gathered his men close, their faces streaked with camouflage paint and insect repellent, and laid out the concept in whispered detail. The Japanese position was extraordinarily strong against any conventional frontal assault, but it possessed specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited through unconventional means if executed with perfect coordination. The machine gunners on the left ridge, enjoying their shaded positions and clear fields of fire, would have their vision severely compromised if suddenly struck by intense reflected sunlight bounced directly into their eyes from an unexpected angle. The brief moment of blindness or severe disorientation might create a narrow window of tactical opportunity, but only if the patrol could position itself to exploit that window immediately and aggressively before the enemy could recover and respond effectively. Carter divided his 12-man patrol into 3 distinct elements, each with specific responsibilities in the complex plan. Private Thompson and 3 men, specifically Privates Mitchell, Brooks, and Williams, would circle far to the right through the thickest jungle, moving slowly and carefully to establish a support position on the valley's eastern end, approximately 400 yards from their current location. Their role would be to provide heavy covering fire when the action commenced and to cut off any retreat attempts once the enemy realized they were under attack from multiple directions. Corporal Washington would lead 4 men, specifically Privates Turner, Anderson, Jackson, and Harris, to positions on the left ridge as close to the ridge base as they could approach without triggering detection by enemy sentries. Their mission would be to assault directly up the slope toward the machine gun positions the instant Carter's prearranged signal came, using speed and surprise to overrun the positions before effective resistance could be organized. Carter himself would take the remaining 3 men, including Private Davis with his exceptional hearing, Private Johnson with his communication skills, and Private Martinez, who was an excellent marksman and approached to within 50 yards of the rightmost machine gun position on a direct axis that would allow him to use the mirror most effectively. The repositioning took nearly 2 full hours of painstaking movement through terrain that actively fought them at every step of the way. Thick vines caught at equipment and had to be carefully disentangled without making noise. Thorns from wait-a-while plants tore at exposed skin, drawing blood that attracted insects. The ever-present mud, made worse by recent tropical rains, threatened to suck boots off feet with each careful step. Roots hidden beneath leaf litter created tripping hazards, but by 1100 hours according to Carter's watch, all 3 elements had reached their assigned positions and confirmed readiness through prearranged hand signals relayed from man to man across the dispersed patrol. Carter, crouched behind a fallen tree trunk that provided minimal concealment but good visibility, could see the machine gun nest he would target with crystal clarity. 3 Japanese soldiers manned the position. A gunner seated behind the weapon with his hands on the firing grips, an assistant gunner kneeling beside him, feeding ammunition belts and ready to swap barrels if needed, and a 3rd man who appeared to be the position's leader, based on his slightly better uniform and the binoculars hanging around his neck, likely a sergeant or corporal responsible for directing fire and maintaining communication with adjacent positions. The sun had climbed higher in its arc across the sky, intensifying the contrast between the deeply shaded ridge positions and the brightly illuminated valley floor, where tall grass and scattered bushes waved gently in the slight breeze. Carter removed the mirror from his breast pocket with hands that were remarkably steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, unwrapped it carefully from its protective leather case, and studied the angles with a mathematics teacher's habitual precision and attention to geometric relationships. The sun was now roughly 45 degrees above the horizon, providing optimal angle for his purposes. The machine gun position faced west-southwest, oriented to cover the valley approach. If Carter positioned himself correctly and calculated the reflection angle properly, he could bounce concentrated sunlight directly into the gunner's eyes with enough intensity to cause temporary blindness, or at minimum, severe discomfort and disorientation that would completely disrupt their ability to aim effectively for crucial seconds. But the mirror would accomplish far more than simple blinding, Carter realized with growing certainty. He had spent enough time in these jungles over recent months to understand that Japanese forces had become absolute experts at camouflage and remaining motionless for hours, often going undetected until American forces practically stumbled directly into them at point-blank range. However, a bright flash of reflected sunlight, dancing erratically across gun positions, would have another psychological effect entirely beyond the physical discomfort. It would make the enemy soldiers think they had been spotted by aerial reconnaissance, possibly even targeted by an observation plane directing artillery fire, or marking positions for attack aircraft. The psychological impact of that belief, the sudden fear that they were being observed from above and targeted for destruction, might cause hesitation, confusion, even panic in the critical first seconds of engagement when every second would matter decisively. Carter positioned himself with extraordinary care, testing the mirror's angle repeatedly until he could see a bright spot of reflected sunlight appear on a tree trunk, 20 yards distant from the target position. He would need to sweep that concentrated beam of light across the machine gun nest quickly to disorient multiple soldiers, then hold it steady on the gunner's position for a count of 3 seconds before initiating fire. That 3-second hold would be the signal for all 3 patrol elements to open fire simultaneously from their dispersed positions, creating the impression of a much larger, well-coordinated attacking force. He hand-signaled his readiness to Private Davis beside him, who passed the signal to the other team leaders using a prearranged series of bird calls, specifically a pattern of mourning dove coos that would sound perfectly natural to anyone, not specifically listening for them as tactical signals. At exactly 11:17 in the morning, verified by Carter's watch, he began the operation that would define his military career. His hand moved smoothly and deliberately, sweeping the reflected sunlight across the machine gun position from right to left in a rapid arc, then back again from left to right, before holding it absolutely steady directly on the gunner's position where the man sat behind his weapon. The effect was immediate, dramatic, and exactly what Carter had calculated would happen. The Japanese gunner jerked backward violently from his weapon, hands instinctively rising to shield his eyes from the sudden intense light that seemed to come from nowhere. The assistant gunner, equally affected by the sweeping beam and completely unprepared for such an unconventional attack, stumbled sideways and fell to one knee. The position leader shouted something Carter could not understand, but the tone clearly conveyed confusion, alarm, and the beginning of panic as he tried to understand what was happening to his carefully prepared position. That 3-second window of complete disruption and disorientation was all Carter needed to initiate his attack. His M1 Garand rifle barked out its distinctive 8-round clip, the heavy .30-06 rounds finding their targets with the practiced accuracy born of countless hours on rifle ranges and months of combat experience. Simultaneously, rifle fire erupted from all 3 patrol elements positioned around the Japanese force. Washington's team, attacking upslope toward the machine gun positions, concentrated their fire with a ferocity and volume that suggested far more than 4 men were involved. Thompson's element, firing from the valley's far end at an angle, created the impression of a much larger force executing a well-planned, coordinated assault from multiple directions. The crossfire from 3 different positions made it nearly impossible for Japanese soldiers to find adequate cover, as protective positions effective against frontal attack proved vulnerable to flanking fire. The Japanese response, despite their numerical superiority of more than 3-1, and despite their strong defensive positions, was fatally hampered by confusion and organizational breakdown. The sudden reflected light, appearing without warning and seeming to track positions with deliberate precision, had convinced several soldiers that they were under direct aerial observation, with artillery or airstrikes imminent. This belief, combined with the multi-directional fire that suggested a force of at least 40 or 50 attackers rather than the actual 12, caused some soldiers to abandon their carefully prepared positions and seek cover in nearby jungle, breaking the integrity of their defensive line. The tactical advantage of holding elevated positions meant absolutely nothing when those positions had been compromised, and soldiers were more concerned with finding cover than maintaining fields of fire and returning effective suppressive fire. Carter continued using the mirror throughout the 17-minute engagement that followed, not just for its blinding effect, but as an active tactical signaling device to coordinate his dispersed patrol. He would flash the mirror towards specific Japanese positions he identified as still active, and Washington's team would immediately concentrate their fire there with devastating effect. When he observed enemy soldiers attempting to reposition a machine gun to engage Thompson's element, Carter used the mirror to mark that position clearly, allowing all 3 patrol elements to engage it simultaneously and prevent the weapon from coming into effective action. The coordination gave his small 12-man patrol the appearance of a much larger, professionally trained force with sophisticated communication capabilities far beyond what such a small unit should possess under combat conditions. Japanese soldiers, unable to effectively see their attackers due to a combination of sun glare, muzzle flash from multiple directions, and the disorienting effect of the mirror that seemed to track their movements, fired wildly and without proper aim, expending ammunition rapidly, without achieving any effect, while simultaneously revealing their positions to Carter's men who could then engage them accurately. The psychological effect of believing themselves under observation and targeted from above, combined with the reality of accurate fire coming from unexpected directions, proved more devastating to Japanese morale and combat effectiveness than any amount of artillery bombardment or air attack might have achieved. The engagement lasted approximately 17 minutes from first shot to the moment when the Japanese commander, recognizing that his position had become untenable and his force was being systematically destroyed, made the difficult decision to withdraw deeper into the jungle interior. Those 17 minutes demonstrated perfectly what happens when superior numbers and strong positions meet inferior tactics, when positional advantage is completely negated by unconventional methods that the defending force has no doctrine or training to counter, when a defending force loses the initiative in the critical opening moments and proves unable to regain it despite multiple attempts. The Japanese forces, extensively trained to expect conventional American tactics of overwhelming firepower delivered through artillery and air support, followed by frontal assault by numerically superior infantry forces, found themselves completely unable to respond effectively to an attack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, directed by some unseen observer who could spotlight their positions at will with uncanny precision. As the last enemy soldiers withdrew in considerable disorder, leaving behind equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape the killing zone, Carter faced a critical tactical decision that would determine whether this engagement became a significant victory or merely a brief skirmish. His patrol could pursue aggressively, potentially inflicting additional losses on a disorganized and demoralized enemy force retreating through difficult terrain. But such pursuit risked walking into a prepared ambush or counterattack by fresh forces. Or they could consolidate their unexpected and dramatic victory, secure the position they had just captured, treat any wounded, and call for support from higher headquarters. Carter chose the latter course of action without hesitation, demonstrating the mature judgment and tactical wisdom that separated competent sergeants from truly exceptional ones who understood that knowing when not to fight was sometimes as important as knowing when to engage. Within 30 minutes of the Japanese withdrawal, Carter had established a secure defensive perimeter, using the enemy's own fighting positions against potential counterattack, organized medical treatment for 2 of his men who had sustained minor wounds from enemy fire, conducted a systematic search of the captured position to gather intelligence materials, and radioed a detailed after-action report to battalion headquarters providing precise coordinates and requesting instructions for disposition of captured equipment. His report, delivered in calm professional military language despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system, impressed battalion staff officers who had expected either a routine patrol report or a desperate call for assistance from a patrol in serious trouble. The intelligence value of capturing the position intact and having time to thoroughly search it before enemy forces could counterattack proved immense and far-reaching in its impact. Maps found in the Japanese command post bunker revealed supply routes, unit dispositions, and defensive plans covering a 20-mile radius of territory that American intelligence had only partially understood. Documents identified the position as a critical communication relay point, connecting coastal defensive zones with inland strongpoints, meaning its loss would severely disrupt Japanese coordination across a significant portion of their defensive network in the Solomon Islands. Material captured included 3 heavy machine guns in excellent condition, more than 20 rifles, 2 grenade launchers, substantial quantities of ammunition that could be used in captured Japanese weapons, medical supplies, food rations, and personal equipment that provided insights into enemy supply status and morale. But perhaps more valuable than the immediate tactical victory or the substantial intelligence windfall, was what happened when word of Carter's action spread through the division and then beyond to other units throughout the Pacific Theater. A black sergeant had outwitted, outmaneuvered, and outfought a numerically superior enemy force holding strong defensive positions, accomplishing this remarkable feat using nothing more than standard training, quick analytical thinking, and a pocket mirror that military doctrine had never conceived could be used as a tactical weapon. It was a story that challenged every prejudiced assumption about the combat capabilities of African American soldiers, every racist belief that black men lacked the intelligence or courage for effective military service. It was proof, delivered in the only language that truly mattered in combat operations, that skill, intelligence, courage, and tactical excellence had absolutely nothing to do with skin color or racial background. The official after-action report, filed by Carter's battalion commander, who had personally interviewed patrol members about the engagement, described the action in glowing terms and formally recommended Staff Sergeant Carter for the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States Army's second highest award for extraordinary heroism in combat. That recommendation worked its way up the military chain of command, gathering strong endorsements at each level from officers who recognized the exceptional nature of what had been accomplished. By early September of 1943, the recommendation had reached the desk of Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, Commanding General of American Forces operating in the Solomon Islands Theater. What happened next illustrated the complex and often painful reality of African American military service during World War II, when exceptional performance still confronted institutional racism. General Hodge, a professional officer who recognized tactical excellence when documented evidence clearly demonstrated it, acknowledged the extraordinary nature of Carter's action and the genuine tactical brilliance it demonstrated under difficult combat conditions. He also recognized with considerable political acuity that awarding a black soldier one of the nation's highest military honors might generate significant political complications back home in the United States, where segregation remained the established law across much of the country, and the military itself continued to operate under strict racial separation policies that would not be challenged until after the conflict ended. After considerable deliberation and consultation with his staff, General Hodge approved the Distinguished Service Cross recommendation, but with a significant caveat that reflected the racial realities of the era. The award ceremony would be conducted within the division rather than receiving the wider publicity and national recognition that such high honors typically generated when awarded to white soldiers. On October 2, 1943, Staff Sergeant James Carter stood at rigid attention in front of his assembled division, while the award citation was read aloud in formal military language. The citation described his extraordinary heroism and exceptional tactical brilliance in engaging a superior enemy force occupying strong defensive positions, noted his innovative and highly effective use of available resources to achieve decisive tactical advantage, and praised his outstanding leadership and personal courage under fire that reflected the highest traditions of military service and brought great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. The medal itself was pinned to his chest by General Hodge himself, who reportedly told Carter in words recorded by witnesses present, "You have shown everyone what becomes possible when courage meets intelligence and training. You have made your unit proud, your family proud, and your country proud. Well done, Sergeant. Exceptionally well done." But the story of the pocket mirror and how it had been used to defeat 37 enemy soldiers traveled through military ranks through a different and far more effective channel than official commendations and award ceremonies could ever provide. Soldier to soldier, unit to unit, spreading through the informal communication network that has always been how truly important information moves through armies, regardless of what official channels report. By November of 1943, soldiers from other African American units stationed throughout the vast Pacific Theater knew about the Buffalo Soldier Sergeant, who had used nothing but a mirror and tactical genius to defeat a numerically superior enemy force. By December, the story had reached African American units serving in the European theater, where they faced both German forces and American racism. By early 1944, It had become something far larger and more significant than a single tactical engagement in a forgotten corner of the Solomon Islands. It had become living proof, evidence that could not be denied, dismissed, or explained away by those who claimed black soldiers lacked the necessary qualities for effective combat service. The tactical lessons drawn from Carter's action were formally studied by military analysts and incorporated into official training materials used throughout the Army. Field manuals were updated to include specific sections on improvised signaling devices and the tactical use of reflected light for both communication purposes and as a distraction or disorientation technique against enemy forces. Officers' training courses at multiple service schools began using Carter's action as a detailed case study in force multiplication through unconventional methods and thinking beyond standard doctrine. The humble pocket mirror, which had seemed like nothing more than a sentimental personal item with no military value whatsoever, became a standard item recommendation for patrol leaders operating in high-sun environments where its tactical applications might prove valuable. Carter himself received promotion to technical sergeant within weeks of the engagement, making him one of the highest-ranking black non-commissioned officers serving in the 93rd Infantry Division. He continued to serve throughout the remainder of the Solomon Islands campaign, participating in combat operations on Bougainville and later in the Philippines campaign as American forces advanced steadily westward toward Japan itself. Other soldiers who had been members of that patrol on August 15th became leaders themselves in subsequent operations. Carrying forward the lessons learned and the hard-won confidence gained from that morning, when 12 men had defeated a force more than 3 times their size through superior tactics and coordination. Private First Class Ernest Thompson, the Georgia hunter who had served on the patrol and whose tracking skills had helped position the patrol advantageously, later wrote in a letter home that was preserved in the National Archives collection, "We always knew deep down that we could fight as well as anyone when given the chance. But after what Sergeant Carter did with that mirror, after seeing how he thought his way through a tactical problem that most folks would have just tried to shoot their way through or called for help with, we knew beyond any doubt that we could think just as well as anyone too. That is the real lesson from that day in August. Not that we won the fight against the odds, but how we won it using our heads as much as our weapons. That is what Sergeant Carter taught us, and that is what we will carry forward." The broader impact of combat actions like Carter's extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Solomon Islands or even the Pacific Theater as a whole. The documented combat performance of African-American units during World War II, including detailed after-action reports and award citations, provided substantial evidence for those arguing for racial integration of the armed forces after the conflict ended. When President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9814 in July of 1948, officially desegregating the United States military and requiring equal treatment regardless of race, the citations and commendations earned by soldiers like James Carter formed part of the substantial evidence base, demonstrating conclusively that segregation actually weakened military effectiveness rather than strengthening it as its defenders had long claimed. The 93rd Infantry Division's complete war record included participation in major campaigns across the Solomon Islands, the Northern Solomons, and the Philippines. The division earned numerous unit citations for exceptional performance, and its soldiers received hundreds of individual awards for valor and meritorious service under combat conditions. Yet for decades after the conflict ended, their substantial contributions remained largely overlooked in popular histories, memoirs, and films that focused almost exclusively on more celebrated units and campaigns, while ignoring the service of segregated black units. Staff Sergeant James Carter returned to Birmingham in December of 1945, carrying his Distinguished Service Cross, his Purple Heart awarded for wounds received during the Philippines campaign, his Combat Infantryman badge, and memories that would shape and define the rest of his long life. He returned to teaching mathematics in Birmingham's segregated school system, but he also became increasingly active in veterans organizations and in the growing civil rights movement that would transform American society over the following decades. He spoke regularly at schools, churches, and community organizations about his military experiences, deliberately using his distinguished military service as a powerful platform to argue for equality and justice. His Distinguished Service Cross, displayed prominently in his classroom, where students could see it every day, served as tangible physical proof that African Americans could and did serve with exceptional distinction when given opportunities and treated fairly. In 1962, nearly 2 decades after the conflict ended, Carter was invited to speak at the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he delivered a formal lecture on tactical improvisation and leadership under resource constraints to an audience of future Army officers. His appearance at the Academy, teaching tactical lessons to cadets who would become the military's next generation of leaders, represented a remarkable full circle from the segregated military in which he had served during the conflict. The lecture, preserved in the Academy's extensive archives, demonstrates Carter's remarkable ability to extract universal lessons from specific battlefield experiences, his mathematician's precision in analyzing what worked and why, and his teacher's gift for making complex tactical concepts understandable and applicable to widely varied situations. The physical mirror itself, that small rectangular object that had played such an unlikely but decisive role in a jungle engagement, became something of a treasured talisman. Carter carried it throughout the remaining years of the conflict, and it remained in his personal possession until his death in 1996 at the age of 81. In his carefully prepared will, he bequeathed the mirror specifically to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, where it became part of a permanent exhibit on African American military service throughout American history. The small rectangular object, its glass still miraculously intact despite decades of handling and multiple combat operations, sits in a climate-controlled display case alongside the citation for Carter's Distinguished Service Cross and a detailed explanation of the tactical situation in which it played such an improbable but decisive role. Military historians studying the Pacific Theater have analyzed Carter's action through various analytical lenses over the decades since. Some focus primarily on the tactical improvisation, comparing it to other documented instances of soldiers using unexpected tools or unconventional techniques to overcome numerical or positional disadvantages. Others examine it primarily through the lens of racial dynamics, noting how African American soldiers consistently had to perform at levels far exceeding their white counterparts to receive even minimal recognition for their achievements. Still others approach it as a leadership case study, analyzing how Carter managed to maintain unit cohesion and combat effectiveness while operating within a segregated system that fundamentally questioned their capabilities at every level. What makes Carter's story particularly powerful and enduring is its clear demonstration of how intelligence and creativity can overcome significant numerical disadvantage when applied with courage and skill. The Japanese forces Carter faced that August morning were well-trained veterans, adequately equipped with effective weapons and holding exceptionally strong defensive positions that doctrine said should have been nearly impregnable to a force of only 12 men. By every conventional military calculation and tactical analysis, Carter's patrol should have been forced to withdraw immediately and call for support from much larger forces with appropriate artillery and air support. But Carter saw a tactical problem that others might have seen as completely insurmountable and systematically broke it down into component parts that could be addressed: enemy positions, sun angle, available sight lines, timing requirements, coordination between dispersed elements. His teacher's mind applied mathematical and geometric principles to tactical problems, and his soldier's courage combined with his men's training allowed him to execute a plan that existed only in theoretical possibility until he made it real through decisive action. The soldiers who served under Carter's command that day all survived the conflict and eventually returned home to pursue civilian lives. Several maintained regular contact with Carter throughout their lives, attending periodic reunions and commemorative events where they shared memories and reflected on experiences that had shaped them permanently. Corporal Robert Washington, who had first spotted the tactical possibilities in the sun's angle that morning, went on to become a successful engineer in Detroit, working on automotive design for one of the major manufacturers. Private Ernest Thompson returned to Georgia, where he became a respected hunting guide and active conservation advocate. Private Leon Davis settled in Philadelphia, where he worked in radio broadcasting. These men and the others who had been present that morning carried forward throughout their lives not just the memory of what they had accomplished, but the deep confidence gained from proving to themselves and others what they were capable of achieving when given opportunities and appropriate support. The tactical manual updates, inspired by careful analysis of Carter's action, influenced military training for decades after the conflict ended. Even today, military instructors teaching leadership principles and small unit tactics occasionally reference the Solomon Islands mirror incident as a clear example of how non-standard thinking can create tactical opportunities where none seem to exist initially. The story appears in military textbooks on tactical innovation, leadership under constraints, and decision-making under pressure. It serves as a powerful reminder that the most effective weapon is sometimes not the most powerful or technologically advanced, but simply the human mind's ability to see possibilities that others miss completely. Sarah Carter, the devoted wife who had given her husband the mirror as a parting gift, learned about its remarkable role in the engagement through a detailed letter James wrote her several weeks after the event, once mail service had been re-established. Her response, carefully preserved in the Carter family papers, now housed at the Library of Congress, expresses both immense pride and a kind of bemused wonder at fate's unexpected turns. "I gave you that mirror so you would remember who you are, so you would see yourself clearly and never forget the good man I married. I never imagined in any way that it would help you remember who we all are as a people and what we are truly capable of achieving. You have made me proud beyond words, and you have made our people proud. Please come home safe to me." James Carter carried that letter, folded carefully in his wallet, throughout the rest of his military service, and it was found among his personal effects after his death decades later, worn soft from frequent reading, but still completely legible. The Japanese forces that withdrew from the position that August morning eventually regrouped at other defensive positions and continued fighting elsewhere in the campaign. Some survived the conflict and returned to Japan after the surrender in 1945. In the 1980s, a Japanese veteran named Takeshi Yamamoto published a memoir that included a brief but revealing mention of the engagement from the Japanese perspective. Yamamoto, who had served as a junior officer in the unit that faced Carter's patrol, described the confusion and fear caused by what we absolutely believed was aerial observation, directing artillery fire against our positions. He wrote with remarkable honesty, "The flashing light that seemed to track our positions with precision convinced us completely that we faced a much larger force with air support already engaged. Our withdrawal, though difficult to accept, was tactically necessary to preserve the unit for future defensive operations." We never learned until many years later that what we thought was aircraft observation was actually one American soldier with a mirror. Had we known, perhaps we would have fought differently. But in combat, what you believe to be true matters as much as what is actually true. Yamamoto, who became a teacher in Osaka after the conflict, never knew until reading about it in military history accounts decades later that the aerial observation that had caused such concern was actually a mathematics teacher from Alabama, using a pocket mirror with exceptional tactical creativity. The historical irony that two teachers, one American and one Japanese, had faced each other across that jungle valley, each doing their duty as they understood it, was not lost on historians who later analyzed the engagement from both perspectives. The intersection of race, military service, and recognition remains a complex and often painful topic in American military history that scholars continue to examine. While Carter received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions, some historians argue persuasively that had he been white, the exact same action might have earned serious consideration for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award. Others note that many African American soldiers who performed extraordinary acts during World War II received no recognition at all, their deeds either unrecorded or deliberately attributed to white officers in reports. Carter's recognition, even if not at the absolute highest level possible, represented genuine progress in an imperfect system still deeply compromised by racism, acknowledgement that talent and courage existed completely independent of the prejudices that tried to constrain and deny them. The mathematical precision that served Carter so well in calculating angles and timing that August morning in the Solomon Islands became his fundamental approach to life after military service ended. He applied the same rigorous analytical framework to problems of inequality and injustice, systematically breaking them down into component parts that could be addressed through organized action. His involvement in Birmingham's civil rights movement drew heavily on his military experience, bringing organizational skills, tactical thinking, and an understanding of coordinated action to campaigns for voter registration and desegregation of public facilities. He understood deeply that social change, like military operations, required clear objectives, careful planning, coordination between multiple elements, and the courage to execute plans despite organized opposition and personal risk. In 1994, 2 years before his death, Carter was interviewed extensively for the Veterans History Project oral history program administered by the Library of Congress. The interview, available through the library's website and archives, captures Carter at age 79, his voice still strong and clear, his memory still remarkably sharp and detailed. When asked specifically about the mirror incident that had made him famous, he laughed warmly and said, "People want to make it sound like some kind of miracle or divine intervention, but it was really just systematic problem-solving applied under pressure. I had a tactical problem. Enemy forces in strong positions outnumbering my men significantly, with good fields of fire across the terrain. I had available resources, well-trained soldiers I trusted completely, detailed knowledge of the terrain from careful observation, and yes, that mirror my wife had given me. So I put the resources together in a creative way that solved the problem we faced. That is what soldiers do when they refuse to accept defeat. That is what teachers do when they find ways to reach students others have given up on. That is what human beings do when they refuse to accept that problems cannot be solved through intelligence and determination. That fundamental refusal to accept imposed limitations, whether tactical limitations on a jungle battlefield or social limitations in civilian life back home, defined James Carter's enduring legacy. The pocket mirror was simply a tool, an object with no inherent power or significance. But the creative thinking behind its tactical use represented something far larger and more important. The recognition that rules and expectations and conventional wisdom all have their proper place, but that intelligence and creativity and courage can rewrite those rules when circumstances demand it. Carter taught that essential lesson to his students in Birmingham classrooms for 30 years after the conflict, and he taught it to military officers, historians, civil rights activists, and anyone else who would listen carefully. The lesson was elegantly simple but profoundly important. You are not limited by the tools you have been given. You are limited only by your ability to see new and creative uses for those tools. The 93rd Infantry Division was officially inactivated in January of 1946 as the massive post-conflict demobilization returned millions of soldiers to civilian life. Its soldiers dispersed across the country, returning to communities where many found that the nation they had served still systematically questioned their equality and denied them basic rights. But those soldiers carried with them permanent memories of what they had accomplished, proof that could not be taken from them or denied. They had served honorably under difficult conditions, fought effectively against determined enemies, and proven their worth in the only arena where such worth is measured, without consideration of anything but results. Their collective service helped build the overwhelming case for integration, for equality, for recognition that capability and character know no color. James Carter died peacefully on March 12, 1996, surrounded by family members in the same Birmingham house he had left to join the army 55 years earlier. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including several men who had served under his command decades earlier, military officers who had studied his tactics in their training, former students who had learned mathematics and life lessons from him, and civil rights activists who had worked alongside him in the long struggle for equality and justice. The eulogy, delivered by a former student who had become a federal judge, eloquently noted that Carter had spent his entire life proving that the possible was always larger than the expected, that solutions existed for problems others accepted as unsolvable, and that courage combined with intelligence and proper training could achieve what force alone could never accomplish. The story of how one Buffalo soldier used a pocket mirror to defeat 30 enemy soldiers in the Solomon Islands endures not primarily because it is unusual, though it certainly is remarkable, but because it is representative of larger truths. It represents the resourcefulness that soldiers throughout history have demonstrated when circumstances demand improvisation beyond standard doctrine. It represents the capabilities that segregated African American units possessed, despite systematic underestimation of their potential by a racist society. It represents the power of intelligence and training and courage working together harmoniously to overcome numerical and positional disadvantage. Most importantly, it represents the broader truth that limitations are often imposed by society rather than inherent in individuals, and that refusing to accept those imposed limitations can lead to achievements that reshape how we understand what is possible for all people. Today, military officers studying tactics and leadership learn about Carter's action as a clear example of effective leadership and tactical improvisation under pressure. Students of African American history learn about it as one important piece of evidence in the long struggle for recognition and equality. Veterans understand it as a powerful reminder that the most powerful weapons are not always the ones that come from armories and supply depots, and anyone facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles can find genuine inspiration in the image of a mathematics teacher turned soldier crouched behind a log in a jungle halfway around the world from home, looking at a pocket mirror and seeing not just his own reflection, but a complete solution to a tactical problem, a way forward when no way seemed to exist through conventional means. The mirror sits in the Smithsonian now, a small rectangular object in a protective display case that most visitors pass without much notice or thought. But those who stop to read the accompanying placard with its detailed explanation learn about the morning of August 15, 1943, and about Staff Sergeant James Carter and 11 other soldiers who proved conclusively that courage knows no color, that intelligence combined with creativity can overcome overwhelming odds, and that sometimes the most effective tool is not the biggest or most powerful or most expensive, but simply the one used by someone smart enough and brave enough to see its potential and act decisively on that vision. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.